You wake up, right? And your alarm is just blaring. And I bet without even opening your eyes, your hand just blindly reaches out to grab that cold, glowing rectangle of glass sitting on your nightstand.
Oh yeah, pure muscle memory at this point.
Exactly. Before your brain is even fully conscious, your thumb already knows exactly what to do. I mean, it feels this completely smooth surface, yet your mind registers a distinct button. You know exactly how far to swipe to dismiss a notification.
You know the exact weight of the scrolling.
Right. The physics of it. You instantly recognize the complex hierarchy of your favorite app's dashboard. I mean, we interact with this completely featureless sheet of glass thousands of times a day.
Which is pretty wild when you actually stop to think about it.
It really is. You, the listener, have this incredibly intimate, tactile relationship with it. But have you ever actually stopped to look at the pixels sitting underneath that glass and asked, why does it look like this? Why do the buttons actually look like buttons?
Great question, because it didn't just happen by accident.
No, not at all. So if you are building your career in design, or if you are simply obsessed with the invisible architecture that governs our digital behaviors, that is exactly the puzzle we are going to deconstruct today on this deep dive.
It is a profound puzzle to solve, simply because a screen is the ultimate blank canvas. I mean, a mobile display has no physical constraints other than its bezel.
It's just light.
Right, just light. It can render literally any configuration of light and color imaginable. Yet, if you look back over the last, say, 15 years, the global design community hasn't just thrown random pixels at the wall.
Thank goodness they haven't.
Yeah, we have collectively evolved, debated, and coalesced around very strict visual languages to communicate intent on that blank canvas.
And mapping out the complete history of those visual languages is our core mission for today. We are taking this comprehensive journey through the dominant design eras that have shaped literally every piece of software you use today.
It's a fascinating timeline.
It really is. And I want to mention right up front, we are pulling the architecture of this entire conversation directly from an incredible resource. It's chapter 24, which is titled Design Styles, from the book called Design User Interface.
Such a fantastic breakdown in that chapter.
Absolutely foundational. So before we start tearing into the history of mobile interfaces, I want to make a very direct recommendation to you, the listener.
Definitely pay attention to this.
Yeah, if you are serious about mastering the actual mechanics of UI, you need this book on your desk. Again, it is called Design User Interface.
It's a game changer.
It really is. And you can grab a copy right now by scanning the QR code of the book link provided in the description below. Or, you can just go directly to hype4academy.gumroad.com/Lou book.
Yeah, reading about these visual shifts is one thing, but having the high-resolution examples right in front of you while you design, that's how you actually learn it.
Exactly. So grab that. Now, to frame our analysis, it is critical to understand that our lens today is specifically focused on mobile app design, right? Rather than desktop or web.
Right. And there's a very specific reason for that. Mobile is essentially the ultimate crucible for user interface innovation.
The crucible, I like that. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, think about when you sit at a desktop computer. You have this massive monitor, right? You have a highly precise mouse pointer, a physical keyboard.
You have a room to breathe.
Yeah, exactly. You have room for air. But on a mobile device, you were designing for a severely restricted viewport. It's operated by imprecise thumbs.
Oh, yeah, the fat finger problem.
Yeah. And it's often used in blinding sunlight or maybe total darkness in bed on a device that is constrained by battery life and thermal throttling. The sheer friction of the mobile environment forces designers to solve complex hierarchy problems at an incredibly accelerated rate.
Because if it doesn't work perfectly on mobile, people just delete the app.
Exactly. So whatever paradigm survives those brutal constraints of mobile, it always ends up trickling outward to influence desktop and web application design eventually.
It is the tip of the spear. But, trying to compare a 2008 mobile app to a 2024 mobile app, it feels like looking at two completely different species.
They essentially are.
Right. The paradigms are just drastically different. So how do we actually analyze these eras without getting completely derailed by, changes in technology or screen resolution or just the varying features of different apps? We need some kind of control group, right?
We do. And the authors of Chapter 24 provide an incredibly elegant solution for that exact problem.
I love this part.
Yeah, they outline an exercise that honestly is mandatory for anyone looking to truly understand design systems.
The ultimate design exercise.
Right. You take a single rudimentary object, In their example, it's a digital product card for a refreshing minty ginger soda priced at $5.
Okay, minty ginger soda for $5. Got it.
And you take that card and you design it in every single historical style, back to back, without changing a single piece of content.
That is just such a brilliant way to isolate the visual variables. It really reminds me of that exercise musicians use to master genre.
Oh yeah, how does that work?
Well, you take a highly simplistic, generic 4-chord pop melody, you sit at a piano, and you are forced to play that exact same melody in the style of like a 1920s ragtime track.
Oh, I see.
And then you have to arrange it like a Baroque symphony. And then you distort it into a 1980s thrash metal anthem.
That's a great analogy. The core data doesn't change.
Exactly. The melody, the tempo, the lyrics, they remain static. But the instruments you use, the structural constraints you apply, and the emotional impact of the final piece are just completely transformed by the framework you wrap around it.
Right. And in our case, the data is the soda can, the $5 price tag, and the add to cart button. The words don't change, but the cognitive load required to read them shifts dramatically depending on the era.
So by restricting the content like that, the designer is forced to focus entirely on what?
On the mechanics of visual hierarchy. When you aren't allowed to rely on like a complex layout to do the heavy lifting, you have to ask yourself, okay, how do I tell the user that the add to cart button is the most critical interactive element on this screen when I am legally barred from using a drop shadow?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Or conversely, how do I design this card when the entire aesthetic paradigm demands that absolutely everything must look like a physical object?
It exposes the underlying mechanics of how drastically different eras solve the exact same interaction problems.
Precisely.
Okay, let's do this. Let's take our $5 minty ginger soda all the way back to the dawn of the modern smartphone. We have to rewind to an era when digital interfaces were genuinely intimidating for the average consumer.
Oh, they were terrifying for a lot of people.
Let's dig into the hyper-realistic era of skeuomorphism. If I am looking at our soda product card on a first-generation iPhone, what am I actually seeing?
Well, you were essentially looking at a digital diorama.
No.
The interface is attempting to perfectly mimic physical reality.
A diorama.
Yeah. The app background wouldn't be a solid color. It would likely be a highly detailed, high-resolution rendering of, say, a mahogany shelf.
I remember this so vividly.
Right. And the header of the app might feature deep green casino felt or maybe stitched distressed leather.
With the actual thread holes visible?
Yes, every detail. Your soda can wouldn't just be an isolated image. It would be resting directly on that wooden shelf, casting a complex, multi-directional drop shadow.
And what about the button? The add to cart button?
The add to cart button wouldn't be a flat rectangle. It would be a heavily beveled, glossy gel pill button that looked like it was made of extruded plastic.
Oh, those gel buttons.
Complete with a stark white specular highlight on the top edge, just to simulate a physical light source in the room.
I remember opening the old podcast app and you would see actual digital reel-to-reel tape spinning while the audio played. At the time, I mean, it felt like absolute magic.
It was revolutionary.
But looking back at it now, it feels so absurdly indulgent. It feels like the designers were just showing off their Photoshop rendering skills rather than trying to build an efficient tool. I have to ask, was it purely an aesthetic flex, or was there actual utility behind all that fake wood grain and stitched leather?
The utility was psychological, and it was entirely necessary for that specific moment in history. You really have to put yourself in the mindset of a consumer in 2007.
Okay. Mass market touchscreens were completely alien.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea of interacting with a complex computing device without a tactile physical keyboard or a mouse was deeply intimidating. So skeuomorphism was deployed as a cognitive bridge.
A cognitive bridge.
Yes, it utilized real-world physical metaphors to instantly explain digital concepts to a frightened user base.
So if a digital note-taking app is rendered to look exactly like a yellow legal pad with the torn paper edges and a leather binder,
the user doesn't need a tutorial. Their existing real-world mental models immediately take over.
Yeah.
They understand subconsciously that this is a place to write.
So we were basically putting digital training wheels on a massive global population. The interface was literally saying, don't be afraid of the glass slab. Look, it's just a bookshelf. You know how to use a bookshelf.
That is the perfect way to contextualize it. It provided visual affordances, which are clues about how an object should be used by borrowing the affordances of physical reality.
Right. So a glossy, beveled button with a heavy shadow looks like something that can be physically pressed downward, so the user just intuitively taps the glass.
Exactly, they didn't have to learn a new behavior.
But the irony here is that while the hyper-realistic textures eventually vanished, the foundational skeuomorphic concepts are still deeply embedded in how we operate.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we still drag digital files into a literal crash can icon. We still save our documents by clicking on a floppy disk icon, even though an entire generation of junior designers has probably never seen a physical floppy disk in their lives.
The metaphor outlived the actual physical object.
It completely did. But why did the actual visual execution of skeuomorphism die out? Was it just a trend passing?
Well, the visual execution was doomed to fail, primarily due to immense engineering friction. I mean, implementing those hyper-realistic interfaces was an absolute nightmare for early iOS and Android developers.
This is the part that always fascinates me. Today, if I want to add a beautiful feathered drop shadow to an element, I type like one line of CSS or Swift code, and the operating system's rendering engine calculates the blur and opacity in real time. But back then, you couldn't do that, right?
Not even close. The hardware and software frameworks of the early smartphone era simply didn't possess the computational power to render complex dynamic lighting, blurs, or textures on the fly.
Wow.
You couldn't just write a line of code to generate a stitched leather header. Every single visual element had to be a static bitmap image.
So a designer would spend hours in Photoshop meticulously crafting the lighting, the bevels, and the shadows of a single button.
Yes. And then they would have to slice that button into multiple image assets, often using incredibly complex techniques like 9-slice scaling, just so the button could resize without stretching the rounded corners.
And the developer had to take all those hundreds of tiny PNG files and stitch them together in the code like a chaotic jigsaw puzzle.
Exactly. The memory bloat alone must have been staggering. You were trying to load massive texture files into devices that had, maybe 128 megabytes of RAM.
That sounds like a recipe for a sluggish app.
It made the apps heavy, sluggish, and incredibly rigid. If you wanted to change the color of a button from red to blue, the developer couldn't just change a hex code variable. The designer had to re-render the entire button in Photoshop, export the new assets, and hand them off again.
Oh, what a nightmare. It was an entirely unsustainable development pipeline.
It was. But engineering friction alone doesn't usually kill a design trend entirely. What truly killed skeuomorphism was that the user outgrew it.
The training wheels came off.
Exactly. The training wheels achieved their goal. After a few years, society had achieved digital fluency. Users intuitively understood that a glowing rectangle on a screen was an interactive element. It no longer needed to masquerade as a physical, beveled piece of plastic.
The heavy textures went from feeling comforting to feeling condescending.
Yes, very well said.
Which is why, if you walked into a product meeting at a tech company today and genuinely pitched a stitched leather mahogany wood interface for a new sauce product, you would be laughed out of the room.
They would think it was a joke.
Right. The source text actually makes a hilarious point about this. It says, full skeuomorphism in modern UI is basically the equivalent of using Comic Sans. It's perceived as deeply amateurish and instantly dates your product to 2010.
That is a harsh but very accurate comparison.
But, human nature dictates that when we rebel against a standard, we rarely seek a moderate middle ground. We violently overcorrect.
Oh, we always swing to the extreme opposite.
So when the engineering teams realized they no longer needed to slice thousands of leather bitmaps, and the designers realized users no longer needed physical metaphors, the pendulum swung as far as the laws of physics would allow. Let's talk about the era that completely rewrote the rules of the internet. Let's talk about flat design.
If skeuomorphism was an era defined by maximalist realism, flat design was an era of uncompromising brutalist reduction. It was a complete and total rejection of the physical world.
I want to visualize our minty ginger soda card in this era. We've stripped away the wooden shelf. We've deleted the digital condensation on the can. What are we actually left with?
You are left with pure geometry and typography. In strict flat design, there are absolutely no ornamental effects. No gradients, no bevels, no textures, and most critically, zero shadows.
No shadows at all.
None. The entire philosophy rests on the premise that a digital screen is a two-dimensional flat surface, and the interface should honestly reflect that reality.
Okay, so it's embracing the medium.
Exactly. Every single element, the background, the card container, the text, the Add to Cart button, it all exists on a single, flattened Z-axis plane. There is no illusion of depth whatsoever.
I feel like the ultimate poster child for this era was Microsoft's Metro UI, which they launched for the Windows Phone platform.
Oh, without a doubt, it was revolutionary.
I will admit, the first time I held a Windows Phone running Metro UI, it honestly took my breath away. iOS was still clinging to its glossy glass buttons and faux linen backgrounds, and here was Microsoft offering these massive, bold, edge-to-edge blocks of solid, vibrant color.
And the typography.
The typography was gigantic and razor-sharp. It was just so confident. It wasn't pretending to be a desk or a notebook. It was proudly declaring itself as a digital grid of information. It made everything Apple was doing look dusty and archaic literally overnight.
It was a very necessary disruption. It proved to the entire industry that software could establish its own native aesthetic without borrowing from the physical world.
And it must have been great for developers.
Oh, a dream. It allowed developers to ditch the heavy image assets and build blazing fast, responsive layouts using purely code-driven boxes and text.
But here is the elephant in the room. I don't see anyone using pure, strict Metro-style flat design today. As visually striking as it was in those early mock-ups, you launch a purely flat app today, and users instantly feel lost. Why did this hyper-clean, modern aesthetic fail the longevity test?
Well, because of a severe degradation in usability, which the industry ultimately quantified as the 22% problem.
The 22% problem, what is that?
So, multiple UX studies utilizing eye tracking and interaction heat maps revealed that interacting with purely flat interfaces is measurably slower. On average, users take 20 to 22% longer to complete basic tasks in a purely flat environment compared to environments that utilize layered depth.
A 22% drop in speed is catastrophic. I mean, if I'm using an e-commerce app and it takes me 20% longer to figure out how to check out, I'm going to abandon the cart and go somewhere else. What is happening in the brain that causes that massive lag?
It is a direct result of a massive spike in cognitive load caused by the removal of signifiers.
Signifiers, meaning visual clues.
Right. In our skeuomorphic era, the heavy shadow and bevel instantly signaled, this is a button. But in a purely flat environment, let's look at your soda card. You have a solid green rectangle with the text Minty Ginger Soda acting as the header. Further down the card, you have another solid green rectangle with the text Add to Cart acting as the button.
Okay, I see the problem.
Because both elements exist on the exact same flat plane, lacking any z-axis elevation or borders, the user's subconscious brain cannot instantly differentiate between a static container and an interactive control.
Oh, wow.
The user is literally forced to pause, read the context of the text, and consciously deduce which green box is the clickable button.
That makes total sense. You removed the subconscious clues, so you forced my active conscious brain to do the heavy lifting. I'm no longer navigating on instinct, I am navigating by analysis.
Exactly, and that analysis takes milliseconds, which adds up to that 22% delay.
And from a designer's perspective, this means flat design is incredibly unforgiving, isn't it? I mean, when you have shadows and bevels, you can hide a slightly messy layout. The shadows naturally separate the elements.
They create boundaries.
Right. But in flat design, if your typography isn't mathematically perfect, or if your white space margin is off by like 4 pixels, the entire screen collapses into an illegible wall of color.
It demands absolute mastery of grid systems, which makes it incredibly hostile to amateur designers.
So the tech giants quickly realized they had a severe problem on their hands. Skeuomorphism was bloated and dated. Pure flat design was aesthetically clean but functionally hostile, actively confusing users.
They were losing money on bad UX.
Right. The industry required a massive course correction to find a usable middle ground. And in 2014, Google stepped in and essentially handed down a new constitution for digital interface design.
A constitution is a great way to put it.
Enter material design. This was the moment the Wild West of app design got brought under a strict, centralized rule of law.
Material design was Google's attempt to synthesize the clean, code-friendly aesthetic of flat design with the intuitive, physics-based affordances of skeuomorphism. They introduced a foundational metaphor that they called digital paper.
I love the digital paper concept. Let's map this onto our Minty Ginger Soda card. How does this system change the layout compared to the flat era?
Okay, so the elements themselves remain visually flat. The soda card doesn't have a wood texture, and the Add to Cart button doesn't have a plastic bevel. They look like perfectly cut sheets of solid-colored paper.
Okay, still flat.
However, Google reintroduced the Z-axis. The background of the app is the base layer. Your white soda card is a piece of digital paper hovering slightly above that background layer, casting a calculated drop shadow. The Add to Cart button is a smaller piece of green digital paper hovering above the card, casting its own shadow.
And it wasn't just like a random shadow effect slapped on in Photoshop, right?
Yeah.
Google basically built a physics engine for their UI framework.
They absolutely did. The material system defined a universal virtual light source that cascaded from the top of the screen. Shadows were calculated based on the precise elevation of the element, measured in dp, or density-independent pixels.
So it was programmatic?
Completely. The higher an element was elevated on the z-axis, the softer and wider its shadow became.
And the logic there solves the flat design cognitive load problem instantly, because the human eye is naturally, biologically drawn to objects that appear physically closer to us.
Exactly. It's a survival instinct.
So by elevating the Add to Cart button with a distinct shadow, the system subconsciously tells the user, hey, this is the most important interactive element on the screen because it is physically closest to your thumb. The user doesn't have to think, they just tap.
It restored that instinctual navigation.
But I have to push back here, because while the logic of material design is unassailable, the execution felt incredibly draconian. Google didn't just hand us the concept of digital paper and say, have fun. They handed us an encyclopedic, hundreds of pages long rulebook detailing exactly what we were allowed to do.
It was a highly systematized, rigid framework, yes. They dictated standardized grid layouts, precise animation curves, and a highly constrained approach to color theory. You couldn't just pick a random hex code for your brand.
No, you couldn't.
You had to select a color from their predefined 500 baseline system.
I remember fighting with this as a designer. If your brand's primary color was a specific shade of blue, you had to map it to the closest match in the material palette, say blue 500.
And then the system strictly dictated that your status bars or darker accents had to use the 700 variant, while your lighter accents had to use the 200 variant.
They even developed the Roboto font specifically to ensure perfect legibility within this highly regulated grid. Now, if I'm an engineering manager, I am weeping with joy, right? I can finally scale my app across thousands of devices and know it will look perfectly consistent and function flawlessly.
It was amazing for scale.
But as a creative designer, I felt like a factory line worker assembling standardized parts. Material design made everything look functionally perfect, but utterly devoid of soul.
And that is the core friction of the material era, which the source text highlights perfectly. When every single app on the market adopts the exact same elevation rules, the exact same Roboto font, and the exact same 500-level color palettes, brand identity just evaporates.
Everything looked exactly the same.
A sophisticated corporate banking application ended up looking and feeling functionally identical to a hyper-local app for ordering cupcakes. The only difference was that the bank used a blue sheet of digital paper and the bakery used a pink sheet. The personality of the product was entirely subservient to the Google framework.
And designers inherently despise visual monotony. You can only color inside a rigid corporate grid for so long before you start looking for ways to break the system. And that rebellion against the strict, soulless uniformity of material design birthed the aesthetic that has dominated the last few years of software development. Let's talk about the era of modern design.
Modern design is perhaps the most pragmatic era we've discussed, because it doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
It keeps the good stuff.
Right. It retains the functional brilliance of material design, the z-axis layering, the clean typography, the clear hierarchy, but it entirely discards the rigid utilitarian rulebook. The fundamental philosophy of modern design is to inject personality, warmth, and emotion back into the interface without sacrificing the usability we gained.
I always compare the shift from material to modern to a wardrobe change.
Oh, how so?
Well, material design was like forcing your app to wear a perfectly tailored, stiff corporate suit. It was highly professional, but incredibly restrictive. Modern design is like taking off that suit and putting on incredibly high-end, luxury athleisure.
Athleisure, that's good.
Yeah, you can still run a marathon in it. The functionality is all there, but it breathes, it's relaxed, it's approachable. So let's break down the signature visual techniques that define this relaxed approach. How does our $5 soda card evolve?
The most immediate and striking change is the evolution of the shadow. In strict material design, shadows were purely utilitarian. They simulated the blockage of white light, resulting in harsh black or dark gray drop shadows. Modern design introduces the concept of the colored shadow.
This was a massive aesthetic leap. Instead of our green Add to Cart button casting a dull gray shadow onto the white card, the button casts a diffused, deeper, forest green shadow.
It creates an entirely different psychological effect. A gray shadow implies an opaque object blocking a stark light. A colored shadow creates the illusion that the button itself is somewhat translucent, or that it is actually radiating its own internal glowing light.
It just looks so much friendlier.
It adds an immense amount of vibrancy and warmth to the interface. And crucially, this was only made possible because modern rendering engines in iOS and Android, utilizing frameworks like SwiftUI, became powerful enough to render highly blurred, colored alpha channels in real time without draining the device's battery.
So once again, the hardware finally caught up to the aesthetic desire. Alongside colored shadows, the other massive hallmark of modern design is the eradication of the sharp corner. Everything suddenly became intensely organic.
The adoption of large border radiuses is ubiquitous in modern UI. The harsh 90-degree corners of flat and early material design have been universally replaced with soft, pill-shaped buttons and heavily rounded card containers.
Now I have to ask, is there a functional reason for that, or is it purely aesthetic? Why did the entire tech industry suddenly become terrified of a right angle?
It is actually deeply rooted in human psychology and neuroscience. The human brain subconsciously processes sharp, jagged angles as potential threats. They mimic the edge of a blade, a thorn, or a dangerous cliff.
Wow, so it triggers a micro-stress response.
Exactly. Sharp corners feel rigid and unforgiving. Conversely, heavily rounded, organic shapes are processed as inherently safe, soft, and approachable. A pill-shaped button doesn't just look modern. It subconsciously lowers the user's anxiety and actively invites the tap.
That is fascinating. Add in the third hallmark of modern design, the use of smooth, angled gradients instead of flat blocks of color, and you end up with interfaces that just feel inherently optimistic. The blend of glowing colored shadows, soft pill shapes, and subtle gradients creates a sense of dynamic energy.
It does. But, I imagine this aesthetic isn't a silver bullet for every industry. The book points out that while modern design is fantastic for consumer-facing products, it has distinct limitations.
Oh, absolutely. Context is everything. If you are designing a consumer application like a food delivery app, a fitness tracker, a social media platform, the warm, playful, energetic vibe of modern design is highly effective.
But imagine deploying large, heavily rounded, brightly glowing pill buttons in a data-dense enterprise application used by medical professionals to monitor patient vitals, or maybe a high-frequency trading terminal.
It would feel deeply inappropriate. It would be like a pediatric clown showing up to do your taxes.
A clown doing your taxes, yes.
The whimsical nature of the UI would actively undermine the seriousness and gravity of the data being presented.
Exactly. For those highly technical, data-dense environments, designers often revert closer to a strict material or flat framework to maintain a highly sterile, objective, and information-forward aesthetic.
But of course, designers sitting on sites like Dribbble are never satisfied with the status quo. They constantly look at existing paradigms and ask, what if we broke this? And that experimental urge led to what is arguably the most controversial, hotly debated design trend of the modern era.
Here we go.
What happens when you look at the extreme flat minimalism of 2013 and you try to violently smash it together with the hyper-realistic 3D textures of 2008?
You spawn the stylistic anomaly known as neumorphism.
Just saying the word out loud makes half the UX engineering world shudder.
It really does.
But before we tear into the mechanics of it, I have to share an incredible piece of trivia from the source text. The term neumorphism isn't some ancient academic phrase. It was actually coined in late 2019 by Mike Hull, one of the primary authors of the design user interface book we are studying today.
Wait, amazing.
Yeah, he noticed this weird, plastic-looking trend bubbling up in concept designs, wrote the defining article that named the style, and accidentally ignited a global design debate.
It's the perfect example of how rapidly digital culture evolves. By simply giving the trend a name, he gave the global design community the vocabulary to experiment with it, dissect it, and ultimately critique it.
So let's dissect it. Visualize a purely neumorphic interface for me. How does it differ from the digital paper of material design?
If material design is a stack of paper floating on top of a background, neumorphism creates the illusion that the interface is a single continuous sheet of soft, matte plastic.
Matte plastic, okay.
Right. The UI elements do not float above the background. Rather, they appear to be physically extruded, pushing through the surface from behind, kind of like a vacuum-formed plastic mold.
Okay, I want the exact technical recipe for this. If I open up Figma or Xcode right now, how do I actually build this extruded plastic illusion for our minty ginger soda card?
The technique relies on an incredibly specific manipulation of light and dual shadows. The foundational rule of neumorphism is that the interactive object and the background canvas it rests on must be the exact same color hex code.
Wait, if the button and the background are the exact same color, the button is entirely invisible. How does the user see the boundary?
Through the simulation of physical light. Let's take the specific example outlined in Chapter 24. Imagine you set your app background to a light, desaturated, milky blue.
Yeah.
Let's say the hex code is hashtag E8F1FA. You draw your Add to Cart button and fill it with that exact same hashtag D8F1FA blue. To make it visible, you apply two conflicting drop shadows. Assuming a virtual light source in the top left corner of the screen, you add a bright, white-tinted shadow to the top left edge of the button to act as a specular highlight.
Okay, so a bright glow on the top left.
On the bottom right edge of the button, you add a darker shadow. The text uses a darker blue, maybe hashtag 68DC2, set at 40% opacity with a blur of 20.
That is fascinating, because the base color of the button perfectly matches the background canvas. The blending of the bright top left highlight and the dark bottom right shadow creates this incredibly smooth, seamless bump.
Yes.
It looks highly premium, like a physical button on a luxury smart home thermostat.
And the state change logic is equally clever. To show that a button has been pressed down by the user, you simply take those exact same two shadows and convert them from outer drop shadows into inner shadows. The lighting reverses, and the extruded bump instantly looks like a concave depression pushed deep into the plastic surface.
Aesthetically, it is a brilliant magic trick. It looks incredibly sleek. But earlier I said that UX engineers shudder at this trend. Let's talk about the dark side of the plastic illusion. Why is neumorphism considered fundamentally terrible and bordering on dangerous for interactive elements?
Because it is a catastrophic failure of accessibility. The entire neumorphic illusion relies on incredibly shallow, low-contrast edge definition. There are no hard borders, there are no contrasting background colors to separate the button from the canvas.
I can verify this from personal experience. I remember downloading an early neumorphic calculator app. It looked stunning in my dimly lit living room.
But then you went outside.
Exactly. The moment I stepped outside into the sunlight, the entire interface evaporated. The subtle shadows washed out under the glare of the sun, and because the buttons in the background were the exact same color, I was staring at a blank, useless screen.
And that is just dealing with environmental glare. Think about the accessibility implications for a user with visual impairments, macular degeneration, or even just an older phone with a low-contrast LCD screen.
Oh man, they wouldn't be able to see anything.
When a user presses a neumorphic button, the transition from an extruded shadow to a concave inner shadow is incredibly subtle. For a vast portion of the population, the normal state and the active click state are visually indistinguishable.
And if the user cannot confirm that the system registered their action, the interface has failed its most basic psychological duty.
Exactly. You cannot sacrifice fundamental usability at the altar of a cool dribble aesthetic. The source text gives a very explicit, uncompromising warning about this.
What's the rule?
The mandate is clear. If you insist on utilizing a neumorphic style for an interface, you can't rely on shadows alone to communicate state changes. You are absolutely required to utilize secondary, highly visible indicators.
Like what?
You must use significant font weight changes, like shifting a label from light to bold when tapped, or implement clear color shifts to the typography or icon to indicate the active state. If you fail to do that, your design is non-compliant with basic accessibility standards.
It's a prime example of why designers need to understand the how and why of a style, rather than just blindly copying the visuals.
Very true.
Now, speaking of visibility, contrast, and how screens render light, we have to pivot to discuss what is arguably the single largest environmental paradigm shift in modern UI design.
Yeah.
The moment the entire tech industry decided to turn the lights out. Let's talk about the reality of dark mode.
Dark mode represents a really unique shift because it wasn't a grassroots trend that bubbled up from independent designers. It was a massive, systemic, top-down overhaul mandated by the hardware manufacturers.
Apple and Google.
Right. Around 2018 and 2019, Apple and Google heavily integrated native dark mode into the core architecture of their operating systems, forcing every developer on Earth to radically rethink how they handle color and light.
I remember the rollout vividly. Suddenly, every app was hitting me with a splash screen asking if I wanted to switch to the dark theme. And the primary justification, the absolute gospel that every tech blog preached to consumers, was battery life.
Save your battery.
Right. Switch to dark mode to save your battery. I do it myself. I run my phone in dark mode almost exclusively. But let's get deeply technical for a second and provide a reality check. Is that battery-saving claim actually true, or is it a tech myth?
It is technically true, but it comes with massive engineering caveats that the general public completely misunderstands. To understand why, you have to understand screen hardware. The battery-saving property of dark mode only applies to OLED displays.
Because older LCD screens have a giant backlight that is always on, regardless of what color the pixels are displaying.
Exactly. On an LCD, displaying a black screen uses just as much power as displaying a white screen. But on an OLED display, every individual subpixel is its own independent light source.
Okay, so it emits its own light.
Therefore, if a specific pixel needs to display pure, true, absolute black, which is represented by the hex code #000000, that physical pixel entirely cuts its power and turns off. It draws zero battery.
Okay, so the logic tracks. If my app background is pure #00000 in black, 80% of my screen is physically turned off, and my battery life extends significantly.
In theory, yes.
So why doesn't every designer just use pure black backgrounds for their dark mode?
Because combining a pure unlit black background with pure white text creates a brutal, hostile visual environment for the human eye. It generates incredibly extreme contrast ratios.
I know this exact pain. If I am lying in bed in the pitch dark and I open an article that uses pure white text on a pure black background, it physically hurts to read.
It does.
And when I look away from the phone, I literally see the ghost lines of the text burned into my retina for the next 30 seconds.
What you are experiencing is called halation. Because the contrast is so extreme, the pure white light bleeding from the text pixels scatters in the lens of your eye, creating a glowing halo effect around the words.
Oh, halation.
Yeah, and this effect is severely exacerbated for the massive percentage of the population that has a slight astigmatism. It causes rapid eye fatigue, blurred vision, and makes long-form reading nearly impossible.
So you have a direct conflict between hardware efficiency and human biology. To solve the biological eye strain, what do top-tier designers actually do when building a dark theme?
They intentionally compromise the battery savings. To reduce the extreme contrast to a comfortable, readable level, modern dark mode systems rarely use pure black. Instead, they elevate the background color to a dark, sleek charcoal gray, perhaps #12212.
Ah, so it's not pure black.
Right, and they lower the text from pure white to a softer off-white or light gray.
But wait, if the background is dark gray, that means the OLED pixel isn't pure black, which means the pixel is still turned on.
Precisely. And if the pixels are turned on, it is drawing power. Therefore, for the vast majority of professionally designed eye-strain-conscious applications, dark mode is not the massive battery-saving miracle the public believes it to be.
So it's basically a myth.
It is primarily just an aesthetic preference, a way to reduce overall screen glare in low-light environments.
That completely shatters the myth. It's an environmental preference, not a hardware savior. But regardless of the battery math, users demand it, which means the workload for designers has literally doubled.
Oh, easily doubled.
You can no longer design an app, you have to design a dynamic light system and a dynamic dark system, ensuring your brand colors maintain perfect WSAG contrast ratios in both environments.
It's a huge undertaking.
Before we zoom out to look at the grand timeline of where UI is heading, I want to touch on one extreme edge case mentioned in the text. It is the absolute antithesis of the glowing, hyper-colorful, notification-heavy smartphones we've been discussing. Let's analyze the rise of ultra-minimalism.
This is a fascinating sociological counter-movement as much as a design trend.
Why sociological?
Over the last 2 years, as the tech industry has been forced to grapple with the psychological realities of smartphone addiction, doom scrolling, and severe screen fatigue, we have seen a niche market rapidly emerge that focuses on extreme digital reduction.
Like digital detoxing.
Yes. We see this manifested in the popularity of e-ink devices, like dedicated e-readers, and the new wave of minimalist dumb phones.
These are devices like the Light phone, which are intentionally engineered to do almost nothing. They let you make a phone call, send a basic text, maybe set an alarm, and that is it.
Right.
No app stores, no social media feeds, no colorful glowing shadows engineered to release dopamine.
The fundamental architectural difference here is the shift from a feed-based interface to a purely tool-based interface. Mainstream OS design is largely optimized for retention, keeping your eyes glued to the screen for as long as possible. Ultra-minimalism is optimized for utility. It is designed to let you accomplish a highly specific task and then put the device back in your pocket immediately.
If I am a designer tasked with building an interface for an e-ink screen or a dumb phone, what are the actual visual constraints I am dealing with?
It is the absolute uncompromising reduction of visual noise. The interface is stripped of all emotional signifiers. You are working with monochrome displays, strictly black, white, and perhaps a few shades of gray.
So no colors to rely on.
None. There are no gradients, no shadows, no rounded buttons. You're largely relying on raw text and perhaps a 1-pixel divider line to establish structure. Furthermore, if you are designing for e-ink, you have to account for incredibly slow screen refresh rates, which means complex animations or scrolling physics are entirely impossible.
A lot of younger designers might hear that and think, well, that sounds incredibly easy to design. Just type some black text on a white background. But the source text makes a very specific point that ultra-minimalism is actually the ultimate brutal test of a designer's skill. Why is it so difficult to pull off?
Because you are entirely exposed. When you have access to vibrant color palettes, beautiful glowing drop shadows, and complex background gradients, you can easily camouflage structural mistakes. But when you strip away all decoration, all you are left with is the raw, naked architecture of the interface.
It's like a chef attempting to earn a Michelin star using only 3 ingredients, like water, flour, and salt. If you can make that taste transcendent, you truly understand the atomic structure of cooking.
Exactly. In an ultra-minimalist interface, your spatial grid must be mathematically flawless. Your selection of typeface, the kerning between the letters, the exact calculation of line height and margin spacing, if any of those foundational elements are off by even a single pixel, the entire screen looks broken and unprofessional. It forces a designer to truly master the absolute basics of visual communication.
So let's pull all these threads together. We have traversed 15 years of digital evolution. We started with the heavy, stitched leather training wheels of skeuomorphism. We violently rebelled into the sterile geometry of flat design. We established physical rules with the z-axis of material. We relaxed those rules with the warm, organic glow of modern design. We experimented with the plastic illusion of neumorphism, and we even retreated into the stark shadows of dark mode and ultra-minimalism.
It's been quite a ride.
Looking at this chaotic timeline, what is the grand unified theory here? If I am a junior designer listening to this, trying to figure out what style to actually use for the app I'm building tomorrow, what is the core lesson?
The most vital insight to extract from this journey is understanding the mechanics of the pendulum swing. UI design is not a linear progression toward a perfect aesthetic. It is a constantly swinging pendulum, driven by the fundamental reality that humans, and particularly creative professionals, inevitably get bored.
We get bored so easily.
We do. The heavy 3D realism of skeuomorphism served a purpose, but it became aesthetically exhausting, so the pendulum swung to the absolute 2D extreme of flat design. Flat design proved to be functionally hostile and visually monotonous, so the pendulum swung back toward the center, creating the layered z-axis middle ground of material.
And then material got boring.
Right. Material became too rigid and corporate, so it morphed into the playful, modern style. Modern design spawned neumorphism, which, if you analyze it critically, is literally just the pendulum swinging back toward the physical realism of skeuomorphism, merely wrapped in a minimalist color palette.
It is a giant circle. The industry is constantly reacting to the flaws of the previous generation. So the advice for a designer navigating this isn't to just blindly chase whatever aesthetic is currently trending on Dribbble.
The timeless truth that Chapter 24 of the text emphasizes is that the superficial style of an application is entirely secondary to its foundation. The pendulum will continue to swing. I can guarantee you that in a few years, the soft, heavily rounded corners and glowing, colorful shadows of today's modern design will look just as hilariously dated as the stitched leather of 2007.
That's a sobering thought.
But if you spend your time mastering the foundational architecture, if you truly understand grid systems, if you master typography, if you internalize color theory, cognitive load, and accessibility standards, your design will succeed regardless of the current aesthetic trend. A mathematically perfect, clearly hierarchical layout will function beautifully, whether it is rendered as a flat metro tile, a floating piece of material digital paper, or a neumorphic extruded button.
It always comes back to the foundation. But beyond the math of the grid, it fundamentally comes back to empathy. The best designers aren't designing for their portfolio, they're designing for the context of the real human being holding the glass slab.
Empathy is everything.
If you are tasked with building a specialized health monitoring application for senior citizens, utilizing highly abstract, floating, flat layers with subtle, modern color shifts might deeply confuse and frustrate them. Their visual acuity and mental models might actually require you to intentionally utilize a slightly skeuomorphic interface, like larger, tactile-looking buttons that ground the digital tool in a real-world physical metaphor they easily recognize.
You cannot let your desire to utilize a a trendy aesthetic override your user's basic need to understand how to operate the tool. Context dictates the style.
That makes perfect sense.
The text strongly encourages designers to treat these historical eras not as obsolete trends, but as a toolkit. You don't have to pledge allegiance to a single era. You can mix and match. You can utilize the clear hierarchy of material layering, soften it with the typography of modern design, and perhaps utilize a highly subdued neumorphic toggle switch for a specific premium setting.
You build your own aesthetic.
Exactly. Once you understand the deep psychology of why these styles evolved to solve specific interaction problems, you can wield that knowledge to build a unique, highly functional voice for your own products.
That is an incredibly empowering perspective. It turns design from a fashion contest back into a structural engineering discipline.
I like to think so.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to know where this is all heading. We talked about the pendulum constantly swinging. We went from the heavy 3D physical metaphors of 2007 to the stark 2D flat screens of the 2010s, and we've been hovering in a semi-flat middle ground ever since. But the hardware landscape is shifting underneath our feet again. Where do you see the pendulum swinging next?
I believe we are standing on the precipice of a massive, violent swing back toward hyperrealism, driven entirely by the dawn of spatial computing.
Spatial computing?
Yes. As augmented reality, mixed reality, and advanced headsets begin to replace the flat glass slab of the smartphone, the fundamental constraints of UI evaporate. Your interface will no longer be trapped behind a two-dimensional screen. Your digital elements will literally be floating in the three-dimensional space of your physical living room. They will be sitting on your actual coffee table.
That is so wild to picture.
It is. And when a digital button exists in physical space, interacting with physical light in your room, does it make any psychological sense for it to be a flat 2D graphic? Or will the user's brain demand that the digital object look, act, and react like a physical, tactile object?
I feel like we'd want to be able to grab it.
Exactly. We may very well see a massive resurgence of skeuomorphism, not as a digital painting of a leather texture, but as fully rendered, physics-based, hyper-realistic 3D objects that you physically reach out and grab. The visual constraints will radically change, but the core human need for intuitive, empathetic interaction will remain exactly the same. It is a thrilling, unprecedented challenge for the next generation of designers.
A completely new canvas with a completely new set of physics. It is going to be a wild ride watching the industry figure that out.
It definitely will.
Listen, if you found this breakdown valuable and you want more deep technical analyses on the architecture of the digital world and career-building content just like this, make sure to follow the show. We are constantly digging into the invisible systems that shape our daily lives.
There's always more to uncover.
Oh, absolutely. And I cannot stress this enough. Every single core concept, historical shift, and structural analysis we unpacked today came directly from the brilliance of Chapter 24 of the book, Design User Interface.
Highly recommend checking it out.
If you want to actually see the visual evolution of the $5 soda card, if you want to study the exact shadow formulas for material and neumorphism, you need the book. Scan the QR code in the description right now to buy it, or visit hype4academy.gumroad.com/Louis to grab your copy and start mastering these frameworks for yourself.
It's the best way to level up your skills.
For sure. We started this conversation talking about that subconscious moment when you wake up and your thumb taps that glowing, cold rectangle of glass. Tomorrow morning, when that alarm goes off and you reach for your phone, I hope you look at that glass slab just a little differently.
I hope they see the history in it.
Me too. I hope you see the invisible grids, the calculated shadows, the psychological training wheels of the past, and the incredibly deliberate architectural choices that make your thumb know exactly what to do without you even having to think.
Beautifully said.
Keep studying the foundations, keep experimenting, keep breaking the rules responsibly, and most importantly, keep building interfaces that respect the user. We will catch you on the next deep dive.